Welcome back to GlowPOP Reads. The story I'm currently reading is Bendy and the Ink Machine, Dreams Come to Life by Adrian Kress. If you haven't seen the previous chapter, I suggest you listen to that before this one so you can catch up with what's going on. But if you've already done so, I hope you'll enjoy this one. Also be sure to subscribe, leave comments, or click the bell for more content. Don't forget to support me on other social media sites and feel free to leave me a coffee as well. Links are in the description. And now, on with the story. Chapter 13. I didn't see Dot the rest of the day. By the time I came back to the office, there were only a few hours left before quitting time, and I did have actual work to do. I stayed late, but not as late as the previous night. I wasn't staying in the studio alone anymore, that was for sure. When I saw Richie lean back and crack his knuckles above his head, I knew it was time for me to pack it up as well, and I was happy to. By the time I got home, Grandpa was sleeping and I had to sneak by him to look at our drawings. I thought maybe it was time to try just a horse. Maybe. I stood over the dresser, hunched a little so my neck ached, and copied a horse from a painting. First as circles, and then slowly drawing over the top of them, turning them into actual features. It kind of worked. It worked better than my old donkey fat dog horse creation from that first attempt. But it still felt like I had so much further to go than ever, especially after the visit to the art gallery. The more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know. It felt a bit the same about the studio, about the ink. The next day, I was exhausted. I'd barely slept. Thoughts wouldn't leave me alone, and I hated that. I hated thinking so hard. The harder I thought, the more jumbled up the thoughts got. Kind of like how the harder I'd looked at that painting in the museum, the less I saw the actual picture. I couldn't see the big picture anymore. I was grateful that I didn't have too many deliveries to make around the studio. It almost seemed like Ms. Lambert could see how not up for it I was. Like she was giving me a break. I decided to practice drawing Alice today, because I hadn't really tried at all, and she was cute. It was fun to draw her. I needed some fun. Did I ever? I was the first one to see Sammy. He came charging down the narrow hall that was next to my desk, and I immediately went from exhausted to terrified. I figured he'd found out that Dot and I were looking into him, that he knew we'd seen the weird drawings on his music, the empty bottles in his closet, that he was coming to pick a fight. And I didn't know what I'd do then because, for one thing, I didn't think fighting was considered professional or anything people did in Uptown, but also because I'd been a lousy fighter my whole life. I only managed to win a few scrapes because it was so hard to tip me over. Instead, he stormed right past me, didn't even seem to notice me sitting there in my dark corner, and burst into the brighter room of the art department. Ms. Lambert got up slowly from her desk with a frown. She could read the rage on his face. It wasn't hard to see. You'd probably be able to spot it from the top of the Empire State Building. "Mr. Lawrence," she said carefully. "Abby," he replied. She bit her lower lip but didn't say anything. I remembered Sammy calling the man from Gent Tom and not Mr. Connor, and I wondered if this was a habit of his. If this was what he did with everyone. Or maybe. How did Jacob put it in the bar about women and black people not getting the same respect, having to work twice as hard? I thought about it as I swiveled in my chair to watch what happened next. "How can I help you?" "Where's my ink?" I sat upright in my seat. "Your ink?" asked Miss Lambert. "The ink. Where did it go?" Miss Lambert's expression now no longer looked suspicious, but concerned. "Are you asking to borrow some of the art department's ink? You can say that, Mr. Lawrence. You don't need to act so entitled." Sammy huffed loudly and shoved his hands in his pockets. He shook his head violently no, and after a few times pressing his lips together said, "The ink in your supply closet." "We don't keep ink in the supply closet." Okay, so that was odd. We didn't keep ink in the supply closet? Then what was the music department doing with a closet full of it when the people who really needed ink, the artists, kept it under lock and key? But I didn't think it made sense to bring it up now. I certainly didn't want to remind her of that whole stealing thing. Not after I had got my second chance. Besides, maybe she was lying to keep Sammy out of our stuff. He really did have a strange ink thing. Clearly. Sammy made to say something, but then didn't. He seemed to be struggling with how to speak. A strange gurgle came from him, like the words wanted to come out, but he was holding them down. Look, we keep our ink here, under my desk in the safe. I can give you a bottle if you'd like, but you need to calm down. This is not worth getting so angry about. Sammy shook his head, his neck so tight that his whole body turned frantically from side to side. Then he stormed off past me and back down the dark hallway, and was gone. "What on earth was that about?" asked Ms. Lambert. Jacob stood up, his eyes wide and eyebrows raised. "Man's gone off his rocker. You want me to check out the supply closet?" Ms. Lambert nodded. "Yes, please. Thanks." Jacob gave her a bright smile and then made his way past me. He then gave me one, and I thought for a moment how impressive it was that he could smile so big and at everyone and it still seemed real. Like he was genuinely happy to see you. My smiles just made it look like I was in pain, or had gas. I watched him go down the hall and held my breath. I didn't hold it on purpose, and I didn't know why I was holding it in the first place. I didn't know what I wanted him to find. Either way, I figured, was strange. He came back pretty quick and smiled as he sat down at his desk. "Nope, nothing. Guy's off his nut." My stomach knotted tightly. I didn't understand what was happening. Why wasn't there ink in our closet? Why was it all in the music department? "Buddy," said Miss Lambert, calling me over. I got up a bit too fast and my feet slipped around under me as I forced myself not to fall. "Fancy footwork," said Richie, laughing. I nodded but said nothing. "Grab that Cowboy Bendy sketch on your way," said Miss Lambert. Again, I nodded, and reached into the desk, picking up the piece of paper and hurrying over to her. "So we're going with the Cowboy Bendy idea, and Story would like a few sample sketches for inspiration. Think you can handle that?" she asked. There was a glint of a smile in her eye that made me think she was maybe actually proud of me, or excited for me. I was definitely excited for me. "Sure," I said as calmly as I could, and I'd handed her the paper. She looked it over and nodded. "Yep, something like this, but make sure to center the image. We need the whole horse. Don't want to be missing the hooves or anything. We can make decisions on how much we want to show later, okay?" She passed the paper back. I nodded okay, but I was a little confused. "So give me maybe half a dozen different Cowboy Bendy ideas." I nodded again. "That's all." She dismissed me and I returned to my desk. I was nervous now. I'd practiced a lot in the short time since my grandfather had first drawn Cowboy Bendy, but 6 different Bendy moments? Was I able to do that? And what did she mean about the whole horse? Had my grandfather forgotten a bit? I placed the drawing on my desk and looked at it. Odd. She was right. The drawing was right at the bottom, the legs cut off. It didn't make any sense. Was I remembering wrong? I thought for certain he'd drawn the feet. I thought for certain it had been right in the middle of a page, like a single cell of an animation series. It's amazing how often we make the assumption that our mind is playing tricks on us. That when things happen that are strange and impossible, it must be that somehow we are wrong. But sometimes things are strange and impossible. And we don't make some connections until it's too late. I didn't make the connection then. I did make it later, and I don't know if I should tell you that now or wait until it happened. What's the point in waiting? No, I can't jump around too much. If I jump forward in the story, I might forget to go back. The memories might change. I worry I've already changed them. Did I really go to the art museum and stare at the Seurat painting with my grandfather? Or did we talk about that painting in the kitchen, looking at one of his books? I know he came to see me that day, and I know he'd been worried. But maybe he just went home after. Maybe that makes more sense. Maybe the horse wasn't slipping off the page. Maybe I thought of Sammy's notebook then, not later. Remembered how the pictures in there looked like they'd been slipping too. Maybe I made the connection then. Not everything makes sense to me anymore. I do remember this, though. I remember sitting and staring and feeling scared and confused, and then hearing, "I'm never going to get sick of that cowboy. Makes me smile every time." I turned a little too fast, straining my neck to see Mr. Drew standing over me. "Mr. Drew!" I said quickly and stood up. "Hello, son. Excited about Cowboy Bendy?" he asked with a grin. "Absolutely, sir. Thank you." "A good idea is a good idea." He just kept smiling at me, and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to say anything back to that because, well, there wasn't much to say except for, "Thank you, but it's really all from Dot's script." "So, you worked for Mr. Schwartz there for a while. Your mom makes his suits for him, you mentioned," said Mr. Drew, leaning against the wall by my desk. "Yeah." "What?" "So, you know suits," he said. It wasn't a question. Hadn't thought about it that way. I felt like I knew the bags that you carried suits in way more. But I supposed I'd seen Ma put together enough of them to have some kind of knowledge. "Sure," I replied. It felt like the right thing to say. Wasn't exactly a yes, wasn't exactly a no. "Great. Come with me," he said, clapping his hands together. I looked over at Ms. Lambert, who was watching us closely. She nodded slowly despite a disapproving look, giving her permission, even though there was no way I could have said no. She knew that too. "Of course." "Yes, sir," I said. It was a strange feeling following him into the elevator. Everyone watching us. Jacob looked like he was about to burst out laughing, and I figured that probably had something to do with my expression. I knew I looked stunned. I felt stunned. "Your grandfather okay?" asked Mr. Drew as he made our way down to the lobby. "Oh, yes, he's fine." "Family can be difficult," he said with a laugh. "Yeah, I mean, it's different, having him around now." "He just move in with you?" asked Mr. Drew. I nodded. "Ah, yeah, obligations. I get it. But don't let them hold you back. Old people make you feel guilty, but they lived their dreams, didn't they? Why shouldn't you?" I thought about it. Yeah, he did. I tried to remember what Ma had told me ages ago. My parents tried to convince him to come here with them to the States back when I was just born. He refused. Had his own stuff to do, I guess. Mr. Drew tapped his finger against the wall of the elevator. "Exactly." He paused for a moment, and we listened to the strange sound of the chains lowering us. "Well, he seems like a nice old man. Just can't have him interrupting the workday like that again." He laughed. Like it was a joke. Like he meant it. "Yeah, of course. He was just worried about me," I said, then flinched. Because of course the next question was going to be, "Worried?" Shoot! I stood there thinking hard. I was ready to lie about something, but then again, why didn't I just tell Mr. Drew what I'd seen? He'd appreciate it. Maybe. Why did I feel like he maybe wouldn't? "It's personal," I ended up saying. It sounded so stupid. "I get it, kid. I get it. But I'm always here," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "If you need to talk about anything, my office door is always open." I suddenly felt like maybe I did want to talk to him about my ambitions and maybe what I could do as part of the company in the future. But not just about that. I wanted to share about my grandfather and how I felt confused that my mom just dumped him on us, and why it wasn't fair she had to work so hard, and how I was now forced to wear his shirts because I couldn't afford anything anymore. I was too guilty still to spend any more money on myself. Not yet, at any rate. I didn't say any of that, of course. I just followed him through the lobby and into the car waiting for us. It was really clean on the inside and smelled like leather. The seats were soft to the touch. There was also so much room I could almost stretch my legs out full. "Nice car, isn't it?" said Mr. Drew, smiling at me. "A very nice car, sir," I said. He gave me a wink and then leaned back in the seat, turning his head to look out the window. So I did the same and watched as my city went by in an unusual new kind of way. I hadn't been inside too many cars in my life. Sure, the back of Zip's truck for a block or two, even riding the bumper of Nick's old beat-up jalopy. And I'd taken a cab once in a while, but not that many times and always on someone else's dime. So to see the world from the street, to be part of traffic for once, not just dodging it, made me feel real big, you know? Made me feel good. We drove up 5th Avenue and pulled to a stop in front of a shop across from the park. Stepped out onto the sidewalk. A woman in a big hat almost walked right into me. Her little white poofy dog almost crushed under my big clown feet. "What do you think?" asked Mr. Drew as we looked at the front of a small, swanky suit shop. In the window was a perfectly tailored pinstripe suit with shiny black loafers that glinted in the afternoon sun. "I think why you'd ever go with Mr. Schwartz," I replied. Mr. Drew laughed and gave me a slap on the back. "Come on in, buddy," he said. We went inside. It was dark, but I couldn't see any dust at all floating in the shafts of light. Instead, everything shone, even the wood shelving. There was a glow to it all. A balding man with small round glasses and a simple navy blue suit came over to us. He had a measuring tape draped around his neck, and it looked so good I thought maybe this was a new trend people were wearing out on the street. "Mr. Drew, come in," he said. "Let's see how this tux fits you." I understood better then. Mr. Schwartz did not do fancy dress wear. He didn't have enough clients. I waited as Mr. Drew changed into a crisp black tuxedo, and I marveled at how neat and clean it was. He stood there with his arms out wide as the tailor measured him with the tape, making little notes on his pad as he did. "Taking the measure of a man," said Mr. Drew with a chuckle. "Always, Mr. Drew," replied the tailor. "Learn anything?" "Some folks have really long arms," replied the tailor. Mr. Drew laughed heartily at that. Then he turned to me. "How's it look, buddy?" "Really good," I said. I felt a pang in my gut sitting there in my grandfather's itchy shirt and trousers with the holes sewed shut in the knee. "We're hosting a party. The studio. Big fancy shindig. Hotel rooftop. Dancers. The works." Mr. Drew grinned widely. "Sounds great," I said, because it did. "Gotta look good. Gotta make them all think." He paused. "Gotta make them all know, buddy. No, we mean business. Expansion in all ways." "The theater," I said, remembering. Mr. Drew looked at me and nodded. "Exactly." "So the studio's doing well," I said, feeling relieved. Mr. Drew looked at me kind of funny. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, well, you know, people are saying that, well, you know." I stopped talking because the funny expression had turned into something less so, more severe. "Who's been saying?" I glanced at the tailor, who had propped himself up on the counter for a moment to scratch out some things on his pad. His eyes flicked up to me and then down. Not really anyone. Just when I was caught taking stuff from the closet, and I was told we couldn't afford to waste supplies, and, well, you know." "Ms. Lambert?" "Yeah, well, she's a good worker, but she's a woman, buddy," Mr. Drew said, looking front and cracking his neck to one side. "What does that mean?" "It means they don't always understand business." I wasn't sure I believed that. Ma was pretty great with money and she worked hard. And Dot seemed to know everything going on at the studio, sometimes even more than Mr. Drew himself seemed to know. "Look, here's the truth, kid," continued Mr. Drew. He was staring at himself in the mirror now, and it was almost like he was talking to his reflection. "There were always going to be people who are trying to bring you down. Maybe it's sabotage. That's easy because you can see it, right there in front of your eyes. Maybe it's whispers and gossip. The worst is betrayal, Henry. That's the worst. When you think someone understands the plan, when you think someone is part of the team, when you take someone in and share with them all your visions for the future. That's like sharing a part of your soul, kid." "Vision is important," I replied, remembering the time on the catwalk in the theater. But I couldn't ignore the strangeness of being called Henry. People slipped up all the time. Heck, even I mixed up the names of my friends in the neighborhood, and I'd known them since I was born. But that name, the same name carved into my desk, it creeped me out a little. Mr. Drew turned to me. It was as deep a look as anything, looking through my eyes, not even into them. Exactly. You get it. You do. He stepped off the little platform he'd been on and came over to me. Buddy, you're coming to this party. I am? I'm inviting you. You need to see what we're doing. You need to be a part of it. I wanted to be, and I was excited to be. I didn't know if I needed to be, but I was all for it. Know what else you need? Asked Mr. Drew. I shook my head. I had a list of needs in my life. Money, security, food, but I didn't think that's what Mr. Drew was talking about. Mr. Drew grinned at me. You need a tux! I'd never been fit for a suit before. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Ma always let out my hems and had a magical way to extend the life of all my clothes, making me stand there like a dummy in a shop window. But I hadn't had a tux before, and I most definitely hadn't gotten one from a swank shop on the Upper East Side. The tux wasn't made from scratch, like Mr. Drew's was. It was one that had been returned to the tailor for some reason. One that he was reselling. So he let me out of the hem of the trousers, which always happened with me, and brought in the waist a bit, and did it so quickly, Mr. Drew and I barely had to wait before I was handed a fancy black bag with a hanger popping out of the top. I was used to carrying these kinds of bags for other people, but this one was mine. And that made all the difference. What do you think, kid? Asked Mr. Drew as we climbed back into his car. I think it's amazing. Thank you, sir. I was still in shock from the whole thing. It's nothing, said Mr. Drew with a wave of his hand. So, kid, where do you live? I didn't know what to say at that moment. Not that I didn't know the answer, it was just... Hey, buddy, he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I know what it's like. You don't have to be ashamed. I looked at him. It was hard not to be. It wasn't just growing up in my neighborhood or being poor. That was bad enough. It was living in a tenement apartment that I shared with my ma and grandpa, where all the apartments on my floor and the one below shared one small bathroom, where the water was shut off for random reasons sometimes and the lights buzzed too loudly. How could I be proud of that? Lower East Side, I said. Great. He leaned forward to speak with the driver, and I leaned back, wanting to disappear into my seat. Soon, we were off, and Mr. Drew was talking about how New York was the greatest city in the world, and that Los Angeles had nothing on what we were doing here with animation, and the actors were so much better, and how he loved seasons and hated palm trees. And I couldn't agree or disagree because I'd never left the city. And anyway, my stomach was in knots the closer we got to my neighborhood. Which we eventually did get to. I hated the ugliness of it. How tall the buildings were. How they looked like they might fall over onto one another. The laundry hanging from windows, the food stalls along the narrow street, and the people. So many people shouting at one another, even if they weren't angry. Just the noise and the heat and that smell. That smell I told you about. Of piss and vomit and sweat. Which street's yours, buddy? Asked Mr. Drew. Are you sure? I said. I really wasn't excited about showing him that. Don't you want to show these people what real success looks like? Don't you want them to see what hard work gets them? They should be in awe of you, buddy, said Mr. Drew as we drove past Singer's butcher shop. As far as I knew, everyone in my neighborhood worked hard. As far as I knew, they worked themselves to the bone. That's why we were a neighborhood of hunchbacks and tanned skin and thin, angular faces. That's why it never got quiet here. Folks were hustling even at 2 a.m. But I did get his point. The point was I had managed to get out, and that was something to envy. I sure as heck envied those who had escaped before me. There was a difference between good hard work and bad hard work. At least, that's what I felt then. In that moment, in that fancy car with my new tux, I felt, well, I'm ashamed of it now, but in that moment I felt superior. I directed Mr. Drew to the front door of our building. It was tough to get there with the folks who had started gathering, and his driver had to make his way slowly. Heads poked out of the windows above, and I noticed Timmy Sharp come running out of his father's shop to peer into the car. I gave him a wave and he stood upright, calling out, "Buddy Louick's in that car!" Well, that only drew the crowd closer, and I could see the expression on Mr. Drew's face was now no longer quite so happy. It looked concerned. Maybe he was worried we might hit someone with the car. Nah, that's not it. That's what I told myself then. But this is my story, and I don't have to make up lies anymore. Not after what I know now. It wasn't worry. It was disgust. We pulled to a stop. "Well, you better get out, buddy. Your fans are waiting," he said. He was smiling, but he seemed impatient now, and I was confused because, after all, this had been his idea. I noticed and grabbed the suit bag and slipped out of the car. Almost the moment my feet hit the pavement, Mr. Drew was driving off. I didn't blame him for wanting to get away from all this. It made me even more ashamed. "Hey buddy, can I order 3 of those?" asked Timmy, pointing after Mr. Drew's car. I smiled but didn't know what to say. I wasn't great with joking around. "Who was that, bud?" asked Molly O'Neill. "My boss," I replied, trying to push my way through folks to get to my door. "You work at that fancy studio, right?" asked Timmy. "Yeah." "You'll remember us when, won't you?" called out Mr. Goldman from across the street. "Hey buddy, you'll remember us when?" I waved at him and smiled. I passed through the door. "Billy's having a party on Saturday. You should come," said Molly. "Maybe," I said, but that wasn't happening. I wasn't going to go to one of Billy's shindigs where folks got sauced and fights always broke out. I closed the door then. I guess you could say I closed it in their faces, but they weren't backing away and I was feeling overwhelmed. I'd always wanted to impress the neighborhood, but I hadn't realized just how many feelings it'd make me feel. Mostly all I could think about was Mr. Drew's face and how he quickly drove off. It gave me a headache. I made it up to an empty apartment, and I was grateful for that. I didn't feel like talking to anyone, explaining how my day was. I didn't feel like practicing drawing either. I just wanted to lie on my bed and stare at the ceiling. I carefully hung the tuxedo in the wardrobe next to Grandpa's 2 faded suits. I walked over to the bed and stared at it. I looked over at the dresser, at the pages of drawings on top. I crawled over my bed and grabbed a fistful before turning over and lying flat on my back, staring at the water stain overhead. As a kid, I'd pretended it was a river and created little towns in my imagination that lived along it, designed houses and even chose one for me, Ma, and Pa. Someday, we were going to live somewhere where there was room for everyone. Room to breathe. I picked up one of my drawings, one of a chubby angel from some ceiling somewhere in Europe. It started as circles, but now it looked pretty much like the picture. I'd never thought I'd ever be drawing chubby angels. I never thought it was necessary, but I was understanding better now. The simple lines that made Bendy were still based on human figures, on classic angles. I was able to draw him walking, and it looked like actual walking. I noticed one of my angel wings was half off the page then. That didn't make sense to me. Why wouldn't I have drawn the wing entirely? That was part of the exercise. I sat up. It reminded me of Grandpa's cowboy from that afternoon, the way it had been slipping off the page. I looked at the next page in my hand, and the next. Was I going loony? Did they all seem just a little different? Were all the pictures slipping? Or was it just my mind? Was it just my mind that was slipping? I tossed the pages onto the floor beside me and held my forearm over my eyes. Everything felt hot. My arm, my head, my brain. I just needed everything to cool down. Everyone to cool down. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. From the frying pan into the fire, they say. Right into the flames. So, that was the end of chapter 13. What did you think? Did you enjoy it? If so, Feel free to leave your comments, like the video, and share it around if you want me to continue. Thanks so much for watching. This is GlowPOP Artisan, or the Apple Lady, signing off. And as always, I will see you in the next video. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay sweet, my apples. Ciao!